Welcome, everyone. We are still waiting for folks to join, so if we could just give this a couple of minutes, we will get started right away. I want to start by thanking everyone for joining Perspectives on Philanthropy 2022, Giving USA in today's philanthropic landscape. I'm Rick Happy. I'm the chairman of CCS Fundraising, and I'm so gratified to see familiar names and organizations joining us today. Currently celebrating 75 years in business, CCS is an international fundraising consulting firm that provides focus to empowering and advancing the philanthropic efforts of nonprofit organizations across all sectors. As a firm, CCS is proud to partner with more than 600 organizations annually throughout the world. It's because of the commitment that each of you brings to your work that we're able to create lasting, impactful change. Amidst uncertainty in the current climate, one thing has remained evident, and that's the resounding resilience of philanthropy. Despite market fluctuations, social unrest, and the lingering pandemic, generosity persists and people continue to give. CCS is pleased to convene this discussion today in partnership with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We thank Dr. Una Osili, Dr. Anna Pruitt, and the rest of the Lilly Family School for their dedication to the nonprofit sector through research and education. As many of you know, the release of Giving USA 2022 has been closely guarded and much anticipated. The report embargo was lifted this morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, meaning you are among the first in the country to receive this information. We're honored to be joined by a distinguished panel of leaders who will offer their firsthand reactions to the report and the current state of philanthropy during the extraordinary time we're living in. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage you to submit any questions for the presenters via the Q&A box in your attendee control panel. We'll do our best to follow up regarding questions not addressed during today's session. At this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Una Osili. Dr. Osili is the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the world's first school dedicated to increasing the understanding of philanthropy and improving its practice worldwide. She's an economist with significant experience in research and policy in the fields of household behavior and economic policy. Along with her team, she leads the research and publication of Giving USA, the annual report on American philanthropy. Dr. Osili has served as a member of several national and international advisory groups, including the African Development Bank, Social Science Research Council, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program. She earned her BA in economics from Harvard University and her MA and PhD in economics from Northwestern University. We're delighted to have her here today. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Osili.
Good afternoon, good morning, and greetings from the Lilly Family School. We are delighted and honored to partner with CCS on this first ever for 2022, Giving USA 2022. So there's so much to celebrate, and our team eagerly awaits this day every year. You are among the first, as Rick mentioned, anywhere in the world to hear these results, and we are truly excited to share them. This year's report provides an in-depth story and coverage of American philanthropy, which has persisted during good times as well as during challenging times. The past few years have been indeed unprecedented, and it is really my pleasure today to walk you behind the scenes to take a look at the latest data from Giving USA. It's also important to note the collaboration that makes this report possible. We work very closely with our colleagues at the Giving USA Foundation, and we also partner with colleagues from all over the sector to bring this report to life every year. I'm especially pleased that my colleague, Dr. Anna Pruitt, will be joining us on the panel, but also so many colleagues at the Lilly Family School work tirelessly throughout the year to make this report possible. So without further ado, let's dive right into the results. And I encourage you throughout this presentation to send in your questions, your comments, your ideas for future research. We are certainly very open to hearing all of those comments. This is where we get to hear from you every year. So on the very first slide, I just want to say just a few things about Giving USA for those of you who are new to this report and this project. Giving USA is the longest running report on charitable giving here in the United States. It's also a model for reports like this in many different parts of the world. It was first published in 1956, and I've had the pleasure of reading many of those first editions of Giving USA and have been able to follow the story of American philanthropy over time. Our team has really leaned on this data, this historical data, during these times when so much is changing. What has remained constant is the ability to look at the data, analyze the data, and see what the implications are for nonprofits of all different sizes. As we go to the next slide, I'd like to just mention that I'm going to start with the very big picture, the top line results, and then we're going to walk through the top 10 findings. So let's start with the big picture. And then our team works very hard to come up with that top 10 list. So here is the great news, the good news story of Giving USA 2022. What we know from the data is that giving reached $484 billion. That's roughly 2% of GDP. And we also know that as we look at those numbers, this was an unprecedented outflow of generosity from Americans of all backgrounds. In fact, when we look at the data, 67% of all those contributions come from individuals. This includes very large gifts, mega gifts, but it also includes gifts from everyday donors, some of them who made gifts in 2020 in response to the pandemic and continue that generosity in 2021. We also have seen that giving has increasingly become not just giving by individuals, but also giving by institutions. What we know now from the data is that when we look at foundation giving, about half of that is family foundations. Family foundations are usually made up of one or two family members that operate that foundation. And so when we take half of the foundation segment, add that to the individual segment and include the charitable bequest segment, we actually see that close to 89% of all giving can be attributed to American individuals. So the story of generosity in America actually starts with all of us, each individual, Americans of all backgrounds, race, ethnicity, immigrant status, country of origin, all of those Americans contribute to this picture that we see of record generosity. I also want to mention that corporate giving was about 4% of overall giving, and you'll see more about what happened to corporations in 2021, which was an extraordinary year. I'm going to just give you a preview there. It's also worth noting that 19% that we see for foundations is actually in line with what we saw last year, but is a record for foundations. So foundations, as far as their slice of the pie, have continued to expand their footprint in American philanthropy. So the good news here is we did see a record year in terms of generosity, but we also note that there are some challenges ahead with continuation of a global pandemic, economic uncertainty that persisted, and economic need, as well as an ongoing racial and social justice movement. So let's now take you to the top 10 findings. Every year, our team works really hard to comb through thousands of data points to distill them into these top 10. And there's always a bit of debate. So I'd love to hear from some of you as we go through these results. So with that, let's go to the top 10 findings. And before we do that, I just want to mention one quick thing as we go through these top 10 findings. The very first finding is one that actually takes us back. Number one is giving reached a strong total of $484 billion, but we can also look back at giving in both good times and in recessionary periods. Because there is a lot of focus on the economy right now, I want to just emphasize that even during periods of challenge and uncertainty, American philanthropy has persisted. During the shocks of the 1970s, the oil-induced recessions that we saw in the 1970s, giving remained, giving persisted. And even during the recessions that we saw in the 1980s, it was only actually the Great Recession that really led to a decline in giving, a cumulative decline that took several years to recover. So just want to emphasize that giving does persist during challenging times as well as good times. We saw that during the global pandemic. We saw that last year in 2020. And we also saw that Americans continue to give despite the tough economic conditions. One thing to note is that a recession does affect households differently. And certainly the shocks, economic shocks we saw in the last few years had disproportionate impacts on households by income and wealth. And so that's a point that we'll discuss as we go to the next finding. So the second finding is that can we go back to the previous slide? One thing that our team has done is actually compare the giving pie chart, which is now famous. A lot of people follow these charts year after year and say, what did giving look like in the 1980s or in the 70s or even in the 60s? I mentioned the period of volatility we had in the 1970s. What we know from the Giving USA data files over time is that individual giving was a much larger slice of the pie in the 1980s. You can see that it was closer to 85, 86 even percent. In contrast, corporations have kept that share roughly the same, around 4 or 5%, even in the 80s and now. But I want to emphasize that despite the seemingly stable corporate share of 5% or 4% today that we see, corporations are undergoing a great deal of transformation, with many companies shifting to emphasizing employee giving programs, to partnerships with nonprofits, to cause marketing and corporate social responsibility. We've seen corporations shift their giving into not just traditional philanthropy, but even into impact investing. So as we look ahead, we expect that corporate giving will continue to evolve, even though as a share perhaps of overall giving, it stayed about 4 or 5%. Charitable bequests have also expanded their footprint. You can see in the 1980s that was closer to 6%. Today, that's almost reaching 10%. Bequests remain one of the most volatile components of American philanthropy, driven largely by large estates and bequests. But also looking ahead, Giving USA gives us a sense that with our aging demographic here in the United States, we expect that charitable bequests will continue to play a role in American philanthropy now and in the future. And then let's spend some time on the foundation segment. Note, as you look at what has changed since the 1980s, foundations have certainly increased their slice of the pie to now reaching nearly 20%, which is the highest since we started tracking this data in terms of its share of overall giving. Foundations grew during the 1990s, both in terms of their numbers, but also their size in American philanthropy. And the last few decades have continued that trajectory. Foundations have also benefited, as many of you also realize, from the growth in the stock market, which had a positive impact on foundations' ability to provide grants to nonprofits. I also want to emphasize that in this time of great change that we've all experienced, we've also seen foundations innovate in a way that perhaps is also unprecedented. Many foundations have moved to unrestricted gifts. Many have moved to models where they're essentially employing more trust-based models of philanthropy, and we're seeing more flexibility around their giving. So going forward, this is also not a picture of stability, but certainly philanthropy is experiencing a great deal of change during this period. On the next slide, I just want to quickly summarize. As our team sifted through the data, we thought to really emphasize that as we look at the data from 2021, it's important to keep the 2-year picture in full view. In particular, economic factors played an outsized role in American philanthropy in 2021. Much of that, many of these factors, a lot of you already know: a global pandemic, a racial and social justice movement, but also for the first time actually in the past 3 decades, we saw inflation start to play a very critical role, with giving growing at roughly 4%, but adjusting for inflation remained largely flat. So despite all of these factors, if I had to summarize the Giving USA 2021 story, I'd say great news in terms of a strong economic picture, economic growth of actually 5%, roughly, even after adjusted for inflation, stock market growth of over 20%, even after adjusting for inflation. But if you put all these factors together, I'd say challenges remain even with the strong picture for 2021 because of the rising inflation rates and the implications for many nonprofits. Now let's go to the third finding. As we look at the third finding really goes deeper into the various components of giving. I just talked about the role of overall giving, that giving grew at 4%, but actually after adjusting for inflation was largely flat. We saw the same picture largely for individuals and foundations, growth that was moderated by inflation, which we had not seen, at least not in the past few decades. What was a very strong outlook was corporate giving. Corporations had a very significant year, fueled by a rise in corporate profits, the strong performance of the overall economy, and corporate giving actually did keep pace with inflation. And so what we take when we put all of these different sources together, we'll quickly summarize by saying corporations actually had strong growth. Bequests showed a slight decline. Keep in mind, bequests are the most volatile component of charitable giving, but individuals and foundations were largely in between. Now let's go to the fourth finding. And here, I'd just like to say, as we put all the data together, I just want to lift up the role that individuals and foundations and the role they play in philanthropy. Giving by individuals and foundations, as we've noted, did grow in current dollars, but not in inflation-adjusted terms. In the past, we've not had to focus on these inflation-adjusted numbers because they were largely comparable. But for the first time, certainly in my lifetime as an economist, we are starting to really parse out the impact that inflation is having on American households. So both of these sectors, individual giving and foundations, reached their second highest level of giving. And I want to emphasize that even with the challenges of inflation, supply chain, many of the disruptions, labor market shortages, what was important as we unpack the data from 2021 is that we had several mega gifts. Mega gifts made the news, of course. Many of you followed the fortunes of many nonprofits that received gifts from McKinsey Scott and many other prominent donors. Many foundations also made the news by pioneering new models that we continue to see. And the question that many have asked, as we've noted the changes that have taken place over the last few years, is whether these changes will persist, whether individual giving as well as foundation giving will continue to take this role, where many saw an opportunity to make a big difference with unprecedented need in communities, with rising economic uncertainty, but also an opportunity to make a difference. Going to the next slide. I just want to say one thing before we move away from individual giving. Many of you know that at the Lilly Family School, we track not just large gifts, but gifts by everyday donors, everyday Americans. And one area that has continued to lead to concern for those of us who are steeped in the data is the participation rate in giving. Prior to the pandemic, we saw for the first time giving actually start to dip below 50%. So for a long time, it's been 2/3 of Americans that gave. And around the time of the Great Recession, we saw these numbers decline. And while the average gift size has stayed relatively stable, we have seen the overall giving rates decline. We are hopeful that with the expansion and generosity that took place during the pandemic, that many more Americans will continue to give, and especially younger Americans will participate in philanthropy. But if I had to issue a call to action on this day of the Giving USA launch, it is that we all need to work to ensure that this tradition of American philanthropy, this norm that has been such a part of economic, civic, and social life in the United States continues to persist across race, ethnicity, and so many different backgrounds. Another challenge, perhaps just one, going to the previous slide, just one step back. I just want to also say that many of you have also followed this statistic, this data point that we've shared here at the Lilly Family School, that individual giving as a share of disposable personal income has also hovered around 2%. You can see in the 1990s, during that decade of prosperity, it grew, but has largely remained stuck at 2%. So again, the challenge for all of us is what would we all have to do differently in the nonprofit sector to boost this share above 2%? What inspiration do we need to provide to donors? What innovations are needed? But also what barriers need to come down to make it easier for Americans of all backgrounds to give? And finally, is there a role for public policy to play to ensure that this tradition of American philanthropy continues? Now, let's return to the next of the top fives. You can see we're moving closer to the top 10 list here. Number 5, corporate giving was a bright spot in 2021. This is especially good news following 2020, where corporate giving did take a bit of a decline following, of course, the volatile economy. Corporate profits declined, and also GDP overall in 2020 declined. I want to emphasize that 2021 was a very strong year economically, and we see that reflected in the corporate giving numbers. It was also very broad-based. Corporations of all different types benefited. And corporate pre-tax profits actually increased on average by about 37.4%. This represented a significant rebound from 2020 and across many different sectors of the economy, not just tech, not just healthcare, but even across a number of consumer goods. We saw this rebound take place. And this has a very strong, I think, positive force for corporations going forward. I do want to emphasize, though, there's really good news here, but there is a challenge in the data as well. It's worth mentioning that corporate giving as a share of pre-tax profits is actually at a low point when we look over time. So there's a lot of work to be done to continue to push on not just individual giving, but corporate giving as well. Now let's turn our attention to the subsectors. As I look at all of the participants on this call, you represent a number of subsectors: the arts, healthcare, education, human services, international, the environment, and so many worthy causes. And one of the stories in this year's data, as we've unpacked it, is a story of resilience and also of innovation. We saw subsectors that had I think had been adversely impacted by the events of 2020 rebound in 2021, and especially giving to health and arts rebounded after a very difficult 2020. In particular, giving to the arts was one of the strongest performers in this year's report. So this is really great news for the arts and culture sector. Many arts and culture organizations had to curtail their fundraising events during the shutdowns of 2020. And we saw that with the economy starting to open up, many arts organizations were able to engage with donors. But I should also note that the strong economy had a very important effect. Our data shows that giving to the arts is very much impacted by performance of the stock market and other economic indicators. So as you can see from the data, arts and culture had a very strong year. Healthcare, which had also been impacted by the pandemic, largely because many health organizations depend on in-person events and fundraisers, walks and runs, and many other of those types of events. And many of those were able to be restarted or reimagined in hybrid formats. So some really good news for the arts and culture and also healthcare. Some good news also for the religious congregations, where we did see some growth take place in 2021, also after a difficult year in 2020, where many religious congregations were shut down, not able to receive donations. Another point to just note overall is that 2021 was a year of a lot of innovation, where many organizations were able to build on the changes they had made in 2020 and continue to build on these hybrid formats. So as we look at the other findings for the top 10 list. Number 7, there is a bit of a cautionary note in the data as well. Subsectors that did very well in 2020 saw some moderation of their growth in 2021. Some of that may just be a result of donors returning to causes they may have given to in the past. Human services in particular did exceptionally well in 2020 as many donors turned their attention to basic needs and helping their neighbors and their communities. In contrast, 2021 did not quite keep pace. So I should mention, it's not that these organizations did not do well in 2021, but compared to the peaks they achieved in the previous year, the growth in 2021 does not seem quite as impressive. The same can be said about educational institutions, where you may recall in 2020, many, especially high net worth donors, gave to educational institutions, research for COVID-related causes. For example, many of those were directed at higher education. And we also had large-scale gifts that were made to HBCUs. For example, McKinsey Scott's large record gift to Howard University as an example. Now, as we look at the other subsectors that performed quite well in 2021, I think there's also good news here to share. In particular, giving to public society benefits, giving to the environment, and giving to foundations grew at over 10%. And this is especially impressive when we consider the diverse array of causes that are supported under the public society benefit umbrella. This includes giving to the National Donor Advice Funds, but also giving to umbrella causes like United Ways, United Jewish Appeals, and even some civil rights organizations are included in the public society benefit category. We also should spend a moment talking about the environment. The environment has been in the news and our consciousness for quite some time, but our data, microdata, suggests that younger Americans are actually more likely to give to the environment and animal subsector. So this is among the fastest growing segment of the charitable landscape, and we've seen impressive growth rates take place over time. It's also worth noting when we look even deeper at the data that environmental nonprofits have been at the forefront of using technology to engage donors and to build support, giving of their time, but also giving in terms of their voice. So we often talk about all the different ways that donors are participating in this environment that we're in. There's certainly giving monetary gifts, but also giving time and talent, but increasingly we've seen another T added, so time, talent, treasure, but also testimony, where donors are using their voices to speak up about the causes that matter to them, and also using their networks, their ties, to bring a sense of community around the causes, and certainly the environment is a good example of this. Now, as we round up our top 10 list, I just want to mention one last finding, and this is one that really does reflect the data. We have seen in 2021 that the word that keeps coming up is resilience, but we've also heard the importance of innovation and persistence. Nonprofits will need even more flexibility and innovation as we navigate the current challenges that we all face, but new challenges that lie ahead. In particular, technology is playing a key role in driving a lot of the results that we see. Online giving, for the first time, actually, in 2020, reached above 10% of all fundraising. It was at 12%, over 12%, and has continued at that rate. So we expect that to continue to grow. Nonprofits will also need continued flexibility as they continue, and I should say this has persisted, navigate high inflation rates, so the rising cost of delivering services, but also challenges with staffing and supply chain issues. So a lot of the same challenges that we've seen in 2021 have continued in 2022. And then perhaps in a very exciting way, we're seeing donors actually embrace some of these new ways of giving and new ways of engaging and new ways of building community. And so as these new vehicles are developed, donors are expressing an interest in using them, and nonprofits are also emerging at the forefront. There are many new ways to give, and many nonprofits are adapting and meeting donors where they are. So it's an exciting time to be in the nonprofit sector. And as we round out this top 10, we have left the last top 10. One that has really provided a lot of fodder for thought is that online giving accounts for 12% of overall giving. So this is the highest we've seen since we've been tracking this number. And it also presents an opportunity for all of us to think about how we can embrace some of the benefits of technology, but also think about how it mitigates some of the challenges. We think about what drives giving. Trust is at the bedrock. It's the foundation of a lot of the charitable giving activity that takes place in the US. And many in the nonprofit sector have raised the question, how do we build trust in this online or even hybrid environment? And so I am an optimist. I tend to think, well, there are ways to work through this, but certainly I think there are some challenges that lie ahead. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining this exciting moment where we release and launch Giving USA 2022, but also invite you to bring in your questions, put them in the chat, and we will now turn it over to our moderator to lead us into the panel. So please comment on any trends, surprises, or issues that have emerged.
Thank you so much, Una. We know how much work goes into that data and preparing the report and pulling out just 10 findings. We know it's a heavy lift, so thank you so much. And you've given us just a lot to discuss today, and I am just thrilled to be here moderating such an esteemed panel. I'm going to do some brief introductions for everyone quickly so we know who we have on the screen, and then we'll jump right into it. So my name is Sarah Crazen, Managing Director with CCS. I have the privilege of leading our Boston-based office, so a special hello to our friends joining us from New England, and thank you again for everyone else joining us in our discussion today. Our panel of thought leaders joining us today for some discussions will be talking about their reflections and reactions to the data they just heard. So I think it's important to contextualize that for Lisa and Kara specifically, this is new information. So they're bringing their experiences about what they've seen in real time, certainly in 2021, but also in the early months of 2022. And we have on our panel an academic, a fundraising leader, and a philanthropist and volunteer. So this should be a really robust discussion with those perspectives represented. So first, I'll just ask everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Pruitt. Anna, welcome. Anna is the managing editor of Giving USA at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And in addition to Anna's leadership on the Giving USA report, Anna also works on the Philanthropy Outlook. So that's a report that projects charitable giving for 2 years and explains how economic variables are impacting those projections. And Anna has really dedicated her career to translating complex research into things that practitioners, like many of us, can put into action. And Anna, we certainly benefit from that and all your hard work on the Giving USA report. So excited to have Anna with us today. Next, I'll ask everyone to give a warm virtual welcome to Kara Ramirez Mullins. Kara is the Chief Advancement Officer for the National Geographic Society. And in addition to that very interesting leadership role she currently occupies, Kara's truly an accomplished fundraiser, an accomplished leader. For over 20 years, she's been working in a diverse set of fundraising operations. So institutions whose missions span research, arts and culture, higher education. And again, I think we're just really delighted to have such an experienced practitioner here to offer her perspective. And finally, it's also my pleasure to introduce Lisa Wallach. And so Lisa, after a successful career as a litigator, Lisa now proudly describes herself as a full-time professional volunteer. And I know I've had the opportunity to work directly with Lisa, and I have to just note the professionalism, thoughtfulness with which she approaches her philanthropy is really inspiring and impressive. So Lisa is a philanthropist, she's a board member, she's a campaign chair, she's made an impact on just a laundry list of organizations for a variety of causes, everything from her children's schools to her temple, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. So we have quite, just in three terrific human beings here, quite the range of perspectives offered. And I'm going to kick us off just to warm up the panel discussion today with a question to all of the panelists. And Anna, if it's okay, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Lisa and then to Kara. And so Anna, the first question I'm asking all of you to consider is, was there anything surprising in this year's results? And if so, what was that? And if there wasn't really anything surprising to you, Anna, what is a data point that maybe confirmed a truth that you've been tracking and observing in real time?
Sure, and I'm happy to start. I have the most experience with this data since I've really been in it for the past couple of months here. So I would say that one of the things that's most surprising and most heartening to me is that we didn't see compassion fatigue. We all know that 2020 was a uniquely challenging and upsetting year in a lot of ways and very difficult. And we really saw philanthropy and donors rise to meet the challenges of 2020. So what we might expect to see in 2021 is donors saying, you know, I've given all I can, I've done all I can. And instead what we see is a near record high for a second year in a row following this tremendous outpouring of support. And in particular, I think it was really heartening to see giving to health, giving to arts, culture, and humanities organizations recovering after a very difficult 2020. And even those organizations, as Una mentioned, that didn't reach the peaks that they did in 2020, many of them came quite close. And when we look at that 2-year picture, growth is 5% or more for 7 out of the 9 subsectors of giving. So overall, and that's true even when we adjust for inflation. So when we look at that picture overall, that's overall very, very positive. And I think, as I say, heartening, and I think a true testament to the work of all of these fundraisers and the amazing work that our nonprofit sector is doing.
Thanks, Anna. So Anna's surprise is no compassion fatigue. I love that. Lisa, what would your surprise be? Or if you were totally unsurprised, what thing reflects your experience the most?
So it was very validating to see the resilience and the increase in philanthropy pretty much across the board. It is consistent with my own anecdotal observations from the organizations I've been involved in, that for those that kept pushing forward and driving through and continuing to not be daunted by the challenges that we faced over the last few years, people have risen to the occasion. I think there is an incredible appetite that people have to make a difference, to have an impact, and they're counting on these philanthropic organizations as vehicles to be able to do that. And I think that appetite seems very strong, and the data seems to very much confirm that across the board.
Thanks, Lisa. So validating something Lisa is certainly experiencing. Kara, what would you say is your biggest surprise or validation?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to serve on this panel. I'm really excited about our conversation. I would just say, you know, given that 2021 was another pandemic year for us and really uncertain, economic times and really intense pressure on nonprofits, it was very interesting to see that total giving across the board stayed relatively flat. I think, it's a really static environment. There's still definitely trends that we want to pay attention to. And for us at National Geographic, and also for any fundraiser, really, when we see that giving from foundations reached its highest level recorded to date, it was something that we were surprised about, but also saw at National Geographic as well. It was significant, though, to see it reflected kind of across the entire industry last year. And since more than half of all foundation giving really comes from family foundations, what we're seeing is the importance of focusing on internal resourcing on individual giving. It was also incredible to see increases at National Geographic in particular across all constituencies. So all of this happening even without travel, without special events, and without any in-person meetings during that time. 2021 really turned out to be a stellar year for us. The society raised more than $74 million in new commitments, which was the largest fundraising year in our 134-year history. We had nearly 60 gifts over 100,000, which was a 90% increase from 2020. Even our average gift amount of just over $200 was more than a 30% increase from 2020. So I'd say the strong performance is certainly reflective of the data that's showing, support for climate change efforts contributed to a lot of that growth in environmental and animal welfare nonprofits in 2021. And this is just something that we're continuing to observe in real time at the Society, which is very exciting.
Great. So definitely a theme in that initial question, resilience, people really rising to the occasion. And so, Lisa, I think this is a good pivot to you, if we can, just thinking about your experience. You're a donor to many diverse causes. You sit on a lot of boards. And when you think about the events of the past 1 or 2 years, how have you noticed it influencing people's motivations to give, similar to what Kara was just reflecting? Have there been some meaningful changes you've observed in your social circles or just in the fundraising conversations that you're having?
Definitely. I think that through these challenging times, the people that are feeling fortunate and who have not been suffering so terribly physically, socially, economically, are feeling very lucky and are feeling even more inclined than ever to give back and support and lean in meaningful ways. I also think that challenging times like these have been good for perspective, and they've also led people to really search for meaning and purpose, and philanthropy and supporting so many of these worthy organizations is a great way that people can find that sense of meaning and purpose and the ability to have an impact and make the world a better place. So I've definitely seen, again, a strong appetite for giving from those who are fortunate enough to be able to do so. There also is a real craving for community. And even if it's been virtual, I think people have really cherished the opportunity to come together, to be with people that share their values. Now that we're emerging from our homes and gathering again physically, I think people are appreciating it all the more. And I will just point out that the decrease in number of donors, though, is something that is worth taking a moment on. I do think there's been a disparity. Those, again, that are feeling fortunate are leaning in more. And understandably, those that are struggling are having a harder time having philanthropy be a priority given the other challenges that they're facing. So I think we need to continue to try and engage people and to build community and to be mindful of the challenges that so many are facing as we try and strengthen these organizations for today and also for the future.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Lisa. And I do like the comment that this is a time for perspective. And curious, Kara, as someone who spends your days talking to a lot of Lisas, does that reflect your experience? And what have you noticed? How have donor conversations changed over the past year, if at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this year was just a year of great change and innovation for us. I think that nonprofits like the National Geographic Society really looked internally and asked some thoughtful questions about how we could potentially pivot as the pandemic continued, and just thought about what new approaches we could take to further our mission while also keeping that sense of community and collaboration that Lisa mentioned. We also had to really start to think about making that case for why, right? So why support the National Geographic Society and really building that case? Because for years we'd identified ourselves as a media company with the magazine and then with the channel. But by 2021, we had a brand new CEO. She had a brand new and exciting vision for the organization. And she was also keenly focused on building a culture of philanthropy, both internally and externally. So under her leadership, we embarked on an ambitious strategic planning process, which was super exciting for anyone in fundraising. It engaged more than 400 constituents, including donors and partners, but it allowed us to really hone in on 4 strategic priorities for the organization. And this was really a gift, again, for our frontline team. It was a way for us to make that case for why a donor should consider supporting our work. And we had to start telling the story of how philanthropy could make a difference and that we were really worthy of transformational support, right? When we think about National Geographic. And as a result, I think our donors really became more curious. They started to focus on how they could participate and make a significant impact. At NGS, it's all about collective global impact, creating a sustainable future, and finding solutions for our most pressing challenges. And so our donor conversations really started leaning more into those priorities. We've also been having some very encouraging conversations about estate planning across our frontline fundraising team. So not just on our planned giving team, and really thinking about the importance of incorporating planned giving into our work with our major and principal gift officers really could not be understated in any way. And I think as noted in the report, we saw 46 billion contributed in 2021 via bequest. While this is clearly less than 2020's 52 billion, it's still incredibly strong and a huge opportunity for the National Geographic Society in particular. So many of our conversations with donors have prioritized how they can create a lasting legacy. And I've been working with our frontline team so they have the tools really and the resources to help those that are interested in making an extraordinary contribution in this way, and to show how donors can have a positive impact on the world now and into the future. And really, I think that means keeping our teams up to date on changes within tax policy, the stock market, things that are changing like CGA rates that can affect donors and the different giving vehicles that they choose. So I would say, having conversations about being a resource to our donors, but also staying flexible and being creative and innovative in the process.
Yeah, I love that point, Karen, and I'm going to turn it to Anna in just a moment, because I think when you talk about how rapidly things are changing, sometimes as a practitioner in the field, it can feel almost impossible to keep up with all the changes, all the discussion. What is the market doing? What's happening with GDP? What's happening with planned giving or DAF policy? There were a lot of questions, Anna, as I'm sure you saw in the chat that came through, about the trend in DAF giving, trends in corporate giving. And so I think it'd be helpful, Anna, maybe just as someone who's stared at the data for a long time and has more familiarity with it, are there a few data points from this year's report that maybe are just representative of a moment in time, like the corporate snapback that we heard Una talk about? And on the other side of the coin, are there really one or two data points that are really representative of longer term trends that fundraisers should have some good perspective on? So it's a big question, Anna, but if you can pull out a few that may be just moments in time and a few that truly may be longer term trends, I think that would be helpful as we digest the data.
Absolutely. I also want to take this opportunity to address where DAFs are counted in Giving USA, because as you might imagine, giving from DAFs is a longer term trend that I see sticking around and being continually important and growing in importance over time. So just as a reminder to everyone, on the contributor side, contributions to donor advised funds are counted under giving by individuals when the initial contribution is made. And then over on the uses side of the equation, that gift to that donor advised fund is counted wherever that DAF sponsoring organization is located. So for big national DAFs like Fidelity or Schwab Charitable, those are going to be counted in the public society benefit subsector. For DAFs to a community foundation, that's going to fall under two foundations. And for the DAF, for instance, at Indiana University, that would be counted under giving to education. Now, grants from donor advised funds are only counted when they're provided by DAFs held at community foundations. But for all other donor advised funds, we take the net of giving to and from DAFs in order to reduce double counting. And I think it'll make everyone very happy to know we have that full explanation of where those things are counted in our new donor advised fund chapter in Giving USA this year. So I highly encourage you to check out the full book and keep it bookmarked for reference. But yes, I would say that donor advised funds, they continue to grow. And what we've heard, I think, a lot in the field is that grants from DAFs are going up. And that's an important data point, and people should be talking about it. But what I've heard discussed less often is contributions continue to grow at quite a rapid pace to DAFs as well. And the reason that that matters, it means that DAFs are going to be with us going into the future. We also saw in the past couple of years that DAF donors respond strongly when faced with things like the events of 2020. And previous to that, we saw them respond to the Great Recession. That's absolutely a trend that I believe will stay with us in the future. In terms of we'll see what happens, one thing to watch is mega givers. As Una mentioned, we had a lot of large scale gifts this particular year, representing about 5% of individual giving. This continues the pattern we saw in 2020, where those mega gifts amounted to about 3.1% of individual giving. And previous to that time, we'd only really seen these totals add up to about 1.6%. So we're very curious to see whether this trend will persist as we go forward. And that's something that we're watching more generally. Will these very large gifts continue to grow apace?
Thanks, Anna. So mega gifts, something to watch and see how it goes. Donor advised funds here to stay. I will certainly be checking out that chapter for some light bedtime reading. And then we heard Kara talk a little bit about continuing to prioritize plan giving as a longer term strategy. And Kara, if I could actually return to that for just a moment, as the leader of a development operation, you have to balance, as many people on the call I knew do, the more immediate revenue needs with responsiveness to longer term trends, longer term strategy at your organization. Can you talk to us as a relatively new leader, you're about 2 years into your role, how have you approached balancing those competing priorities at the society?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a struggle that every nonprofit faces, and I've seen it in every step of my career. But I'll start by saying that the National Geographic Society has a really unique business model that allows 100% of all donor gifts to go to our mission work. So with the support from our partnership with Disney and then with our endowment, we do not have to fund operating costs from philanthropy. However, the pandemic really highlighted the need for us to think about putting some processes in place to support immediate and unplanned needs for those that we serve. So a great example of this was our ability to act quickly to raise and allocate almost $2.5 million actually for a COVID-19 emergency fund for journalists, for educators, and for scientists. So the fund really supported those working to document the impact of the pandemic as it was happening in real time, but also allowed support for educating students in a new digital environment. What does it look like to teach from home? And also allowed us to fund the protection of species and habitats in areas where tourism had really dropped off due to the pandemic. Knowing that even though we were all kind of locked in place, there were still animals and environmental destruction happening around the world. So by the end of 2021, with this fund, we were able to support 324 projects in 72 countries, which was an incredible, opportunity and something that we could kind of pull together in the midst of a really crazy time. But with all of that said, we still know that we need to balance immediate revenue needs with long-term responsiveness, just like any other nonprofit. And again, through the leadership of our CEO, Jill Tiefenthaler, and her vision with our new strategic plan, we're extremely focused on strengthening our joint venture with Disney, building the Society's endowment, cultivating, again, this culture of philanthropy, and identifying new revenue producing programs that align with our mission. So the good news is that over the past year, we've been able to really sustain momentum, moving forward with our strategy and giving our frontline fundraisers the tools and the resources they need to be successful, even in a virtual or hybrid world, wherever we may end up, but giving them the tools that they need to be successful long-term and short-term.
Thanks, Kara. And Lisa, I hope you don't mind because we have a couple extra minutes, but as Kara was offering the reflection from her seat as the Chief Advancement Officer, as the development leader, I'm curious just around your board tables right now, what is the appetite for this conversation about immediate revenue needs versus long-term planning? How are you encouraging fundraising leaders at the organizations where you're involved to think about this?
So I actively drooling over the situation that you described. So great job, Kara. It must be nice not to really have to worry about operating needs. In most of the organizations that I am involved with, that does remain a huge priority. And obviously the stresses of the COVID environment increased the operating needs for many organizations. But I am pleased to say that in almost every organization I'm involved in, we are actively also talking about the long-term needs, the importance of legacy giving, endowment campaigns, and keeping our eye on the future and trying to transform the culture from less immediate, less transactional, to more of a long-term philosophy for our boards and also for our donor base. And I think the shift from annual transactional to relational and multi-year commitments is something that had started before the pandemic and certainly continues. And I think that the learnings from having all in-person gatherings shut down reinforced how important it is to not be so event dependent and to really be thinking about building relationships with donors that will withstand all kinds of challenge. And that includes conversations about the future, about legacy giving, about support for endowment. So in most places that I've been involved, once we get our heads above water to the place where we are confident that the business can run, the shift has been to also engage in endowment giving and to change the culture around legacy giving as well, even with young families, and to try and socialize and get people comfortable with the idea of planful philanthropy, of estate planning, of using vehicles like donor advised funds to try and ensure that the things that they care about today will continue into the future. And it's also a great opportunity for people to have meaningful discussions with their kids and to try and model philanthropy for the next generation. So we're trying very hard to focus on that, despite the need to continue to focus on immediate operational needs in most places.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection, Lisa. I appreciate that. And Kara and I know in our prep call earlier, we were talking about the legacy giving that we see in the Giving USA report. A lot of that is the result of conversations that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago with an organization. So just something for us to continue to be mindful of. I agree it's a really it's a tough balance, but sounds like both Kara and Lisa are striking it well at their respective organizations. I'll just close because we have a few minutes left here. We do have the webinar ending at 2:15 Eastern, just to give us a little extra time for closing remarks, but we'll shift there now. And Annie, you mentioned the longer term trends that you think are here to stay. You talked about mega gifts as maybe something being we'll wait and see and look at how that evolves over the next couple of years. For those of us on the call, if you had to pick just one trend or one data point for us to really watch in 2022, we're all back in June of 2023 talking about the 2022 report, what would you encourage us to really focus on?
One of the things I most love about the Giving USA project is that we have this time series data. We have not just 40 years, we have data going back all the way to the 50s. So we're we're able to track what are the long-term trends, what are the long-term relationships that we see between charitable giving and the economy. And as Una has so capably explained, we know that the end of year market for the S&P 500 and we know end of year GDP are closely related to what we see happening in giving. So this is absolutely something that you should be tracking. However, it's not just what the markets are doing, it's also how people feel about whatever is happening. So one of the things that we know is that, people make decisions based on emotion primarily. So when people feel uncertain about the future and their finances, they may not be as likely to give. And it's the same thing with legislation. Theoretically, we know things like the current push to extend the charitable tax deduction to non-itemizers. That's theoretically very good for charitable giving. But the issue is, are people even aware of it? There was an extension of that deduction that happened quite late in 2021 to the point where I think it's possible that, not that many donors were even aware that it was happening. It wasn't widely covered in the media and it didn't happen until quite late in the year. So I think that there's a two-part process here. One is identifying those big economic trends, the S&P 500, GDP, personal income, all of the things that that Una talked about today and that we talk about at length in the Giving USA book. But it's also the second part. How are your donors relating to each of those things? Because those decisions are being made by human beings. It's not someone plugging all of their information into an algorithm to make the decision. So I think it's important to make sure that you're understanding how each of those factors are being received by the folks that you work with.
Wow, Anna, what a great point. I love that, because I think so often, especially in the macro data set, we do think about the overall trends of the markets and GDP and corporate profits. But what a terrific point you just made. I think that's a great takeaway. And I think a good segue, Kara, for your final question, what are you just most excited about as an organizational leader right now when you think about what philanthropy could do for the National Geographic Society and the broader sector you work in the coming years?
Sure. When I think about philanthropy, I'd say, in the coming years, I think about this incredible response we've seen to urgent needs, but also the interest, again, in sustaining organizations for the long term. So I'm really encouraged to think that philanthropy today and tomorrow will contribute to building these vibrant communities and driving change and creating, again, at least from National Geographic's perspective, a much healthier planet. So we're seeing that at NGS as we speak. I would also remind everyone on this call to really focus on relationship building with your constituencies, right? So continuing to engage, cultivate, and steward donors and partners at the highest level, share the impact of their support, continue to tell that story. We think about investing in annual giving at National Geographic all the time as we think about how we could continue to help to increase that 50% giving among US households in a pipeline that turns into major and principal giving for an organization. So not just plain giving, but thinking about the full scope of constituency groups that could be a part of supporting your organization. I'm personally excited about a very tangible outcome, I'd say, from the power of philanthropy at National Geographic, where we're actually reimagining our headquarters in Washington, D.C. over the next year. So it will be a new base camp for us to celebrate the power of science and exploration and education and storytelling with the entire global community. So we'll be breaking ground this fall, and we're super excited about it. We've seen philanthropists who are supporting some extraordinary renovations and new builds that will provide increased access for all across the country. And we want to be a part of that and really bring this new kind of state-of-the-art base camp to DC to be a destination where we can really share the work that we're doing with others, but also provide a home for our explorers who are really the heartbeat of our organization, with the opportunity to come together again to collaborate, inspire, push boundaries. Again, this is a dream for frontline fundraisers to have this kind of access to our experts essentially in the field. So I have to say, there's just something really extraordinary about philanthropy in our country right now, just being the driving force behind creating such incredible space for learning and exploration. I feel very lucky to be a part of it.
Great. So Anna's takeaway for us is, remember, giving decisions are made by people with emotions and hopes and dreams and priorities, not algorithms. Kara, your takeaway for us is, think about, back to your earlier point, what is the case? What's exciting? What is your organization doing for the world? And really tell that story. And Lisa, I'm going to give you the last word here. As someone, again, who's a donor to a lot of causes, who sits on a lot of boards, what's your best practical tip for fundraisers and development professionals as they plan for the year ahead?
Well, first up, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I've learned so much from listening to everyone, and can't wait to dig in deeper into the data. It really has been a privilege. I do think that donors are usually motivated by emotion, but the best way to get at that emotion is with a compelling case and to help people understand why an investment in a particular organization will make a difference, and of course, why a larger investment will hopefully have even greater impact. So that is the challenge, I think, for every organization that depends on philanthropy, is how to position itself in a compelling way to identify donors for whom the message should resonate and who hopefully have capacity to support, and then to get in front of them in a really personal and engaging way. I think that we've learned through the pandemic about the importance of technology, but we can't rely just on technology, and we also can't rely just on large events anymore. I think we really have to be personal and engaged, and to steward our donors along in a really meaningful way that gives them a chance to learn and understand how their dollars can have a real impact on causes that they care about. So I think we need to be innovative, but we need to just stick with it. And I would encourage all the professionals out there, no matter how challenging it may get around us, and we've certainly been through some challenging times, the biggest takeaway from this report is truly how resilient philanthropy is and how there really is an appetite out there for people to give and to do good. And so walk tall and proud and keep giving us as donors an opportunity to leverage the ability that we can impact the world through partnership with so many amazing organizations that I'm sure are represented on this call.
Wow,
Thanks.
Lisa, I'm almost sorry that I have to give the logistical closing comments now, because that was really just, I think, an inspiring note to end on. And I just want to thank again everyone for joining today. Thank you to Lisa and Anna and Kara, and of course Una, for leading us in the discussion today. Just a final few logistical notes. You will be receiving the recording and the slides from today's presentation. It will be distributed via email, the email that you registered with. And just on behalf of CCS Fundraising, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and all of our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today, and make it a great week.